For sure. So we have this tendency to kind of deify our founding fathers
Mhm.
and our leaders, and like we cannot critique them because they were genius and they were brilliant. And blah blah blah. Blah. Did many of them write really well and like create tax codes that worked well? Yeah, sure. Were many of them also like evil people who use brutal violence against enslaved people? Also, yes.
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti war podcast about war. Now, I watched a lot of sports this past month. Sports I knew existed, like football, and sports I had just learned about this Winter Olympics and then got super invested in, like women's monobob, one woman bobsledding, which America won gold. Congrats, Elena Myers Taylor. And with all the flags and chants, I can't stop thinking about the question of who gets to claim America. Now, according to Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl, America belongs to the people who live in it, including all of North, Central, and South America. And then contrast that to the men's hockey team who won gold after a 3-on-3 overtime, but that's not the issue here. I'll save that anger for a different podcast. Celebrated with FBI Director Kash Patel on a break from covering up the Epstein files to party in Milan. And he then called in the president, and they all had a laugh, the entire team, at the gold medal winning women's team's expense. Woo! So who gets to claim America, if not the gold medal winning women's team? So to go deep into the myth of American freedom, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Victoria Alexander-Thompson, a researcher, public speaker, and content creator whom I met through the Mamdani campaign. So you know already she's awesome. Welcome, Victoria.
Hi, Orly. Great to be here.
Yeah, so tell us about your research.
For sure. So I too am very upset with the U.S. men's hockey team, but my research does not focus on athletics really in any material way. Dissertation research focused on Black college student activism and then university policy as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So 2025 was a challenging time to graduate with a degree in DEI in college and try to find a job. Still trying, but more broadly, my research focuses on social and racial justice education, primarily in higher education. And then within that, I have a closer focus on Black student experiences and racial identity development.
That's amazing. And so w- w- you have research into present day, but then let's go further back in time because, yeah, you have created excellent content about revolutionary times, the original American Revolution, the Civil War. So who gets to claim America? What is the history of the myth of American freedom?
For sure. So most of my research focuses on present day, right? But we can't understand the intricacies of social dynamics in the present day unless we understand the ways that they have been built, legislated, reinforced, both politically, legally, and socially. So recently, I worked at the University of Maryland in our social justice initiative or social justice alliance organization, where we partner with University of Maryland, SJA, and the Bowie State University, SJA. Um, and that was started through a tragedy, right? There was a um, stabbing murder at the University of Maryland. A Black Bowie State University student named Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III was visiting friends on the University of Maryland College Park campus, and a white student who was like active in white supremacist chat rooms um, approached him on campus, told him to get out of his way. And then when he didn't, he stabbed him and killed him. And Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III was, I think, 2 or 3 days away from graduating from Bowie State University. He was just a couple days after he was part of ROTC, a couple days after being commissioned to the United States Army. So that particular experience working at the University of Maryland with SJA and working with the family and the parents of Lieutenant Collins, Don and Richard Collins are his parents. They talk a lot about who has the word patriot and like who gets to be proud to be American and who is thought to like serve their country the most. And when we look at the statistics of it, Black people have always been overrepresented in the military for as long as we have been allowed to join the military. So presently, like, reading through the documents of Freedom 250 or the 250 Committee or Project 1776 or whatever else the Trump administration and private public partners have worked on, there's a glaring absence of the contributions of Black people, as well as a glaring absence of the contradictions between celebrating freedom in America without acknowledging that the United States or the colonies that would come to be the United States practiced enslavement before, during, and after the American Revolution. And so when thinking about like who gets to be American, who gets to be a patriot, when we look at our original founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the concept of democracy and equal representation, Black people in the United States have always fought toward perfecting those ideals and making them real, even when the founders fought to make it so only very certain people could access those values equitably. So that's part of what I've been doing on social media, where I talk about things that are not within my like usual realm of research because my degree is in education, not in history. But I do think that it's imperative to understand history, to understand the present.
Yes, with regards to the American Revolution, I learned from you about Somerset v. Stuart, about the
Mm,
revolution for freedom was also to protect the institution of slavery. So tell us about that
hmm
case.
Sure. 1772, there's a man, an enslaver, living in Boston, and he is visiting England. So he takes a man who he is enslaving, his name is James Somerset, to England. James Somerset gets baptized in England. And one of the early justifications for slavery, specifically chattel slavery, which tied being Black to being enslaved, um, one of the uh, mm, reasons, I guess, or justifications for slavery that enslavers gave was they're not Christian, so we can enslave them. So then Black people were like, well, I don't want to be enslaved, so I'll just be Christian. And sometimes that would get them their freedom. They would be emancipated by their enslavers if they would convert to Christianity. Enslavers realize though that that means that they can't enslave people and then can't, reap the financial benefits of this moral corruption of slavery. So Somerset gets baptized. In getting baptized, he gets godparents. And these godparents are white English people who are also Quakers. Did many Quakers enslave people early in the transatlantic slave trade? Yes. Were Quakers also instrumental in the abolition of slavery more than most other Christian factions? Also, yes. Um, so gets baptized, escapes, gets caught. Then his enslaver, Stuart, imprisons him, not legally, but like locks him inside of a boat and says, for trying to escape enslavement, I am going to sell you back into slavery, this time in Jamaica. And slavery in the Caribbean was known to be um, incredibly dangerous and incredibly violent. It's also incredibly dangerous and violent in the United States. But the understanding at the time was that being enslaved in the Caribbean was harder or came with different challenges. Particularly when compared to being enslaved in Boston, which is Massachusetts is one of the more abolitionist-minded colonies at the time. So his godparents then take that to court and say, there's no slavery in England, or at least there shouldn't be. There is, but it's not legally enshrined in the same way as it is in the United States. Um, he's a Christian. He should be released. Um, so then the judge at the time, Mansfield? Yes. Lord Mansfield takes this case and he tells Stuart, the enslaver, like, hey, can you please drop this? Just let this guy go, because if I rule on this, I have to use English common law, which doesn't mention slavery. So I can't use your laws to say that he is enslaved and then owned by you, because according to English common law, that's just not a thing. But I don't want people to know that's not a thing because we very obviously have enslaved people here, and I can't make this ruling. And then what are these enslaved people going to do? They're going to say, I'm not really enslaved here. I haven't been enslaved this whole time. Like, I'm out. And people are going to be very upset by that. And also at the time, this is 1772. So the American Revolution is already like, it technically hasn't like kicked off, I guess, but the spirit of revolution is very present. And many colonists, particularly patriots, and also some loyalists, particularly in the South, are very worried that in remaining an English colony, they then don't get direct control over whether or not slavery continues. But if they're independent, then they can control whether or not slavery continues. And if you've, watched Hamilton or listened to the
Yeah.
soundtrack like I have, you know that there's a lot of debate over like what to do about slavery. Many of the founders like believe that slavery is bad, but also did it for their entire lives and did not free the people they were enslaving when they died. So I can think that something's bad and still do it, and then I'm still a bad person. So anyways, Stewart says that man is my property, bleh, and moves forward with the case. Mansfield rules that slavery is not legally enshrined in English common law. People cannot be considered property under English common law. He also can't be considered an indentured servant because both parties have to consent to a contract of servitude, and Stewart, or rather Somerset, did not consent to that since he's trying to escape. Um, Therefore, you cannot hold him in your little boat because he hasn't broken a law. You cannot force him to go to Jamaica because you can't force him to do anything. He doesn't belong to you. You have to let him go. And he does. But that case kind of broadcasted to the world that even though slavery has been practiced in England for hundreds of years, it hasn't been enshrined in their legal documents in the same way that it has in many of the state and colony documents in the United States. So then colonists start to become fearful that Britain will abolish slavery legally, which they do in a few years after that. And they also start to worry that Britain will then use abolition or individual emancipations as a tactic of war, which they also do. And so that is not like the stated reason for the American Revolution. Slavery is not mentioned in the final like Declaration of Independence. It was mentioned in earlier versions of it, but that was taken out.
Wow. Does that show like kind of like an admission of guilt that they're like, oh, we know this is bad, but it's a bad look. Let's go with we're not defending our property of human beings, but rather
Right.
our right to control the price of tea.
100%. And they do that like sneakily. Like they do it in the Constitution too. Like if you control F in the Constitution, you will not find the word slave, but you will find that certain people in the South are only counted as 3/5 of a person, or you will find that like we have to talk about in 1808 whether or not we're going to continue to import people.
My God.
You don't. People emigrate, they migrate, they don't typically get imported unless they're enslaved. So they don't use the words because even at the time, many people were like, "Hey, stupid! It looks ridiculous that you're claiming to be in favor of freedom and liberty, but many of you are also enslaving hundreds of people at your house right now."
That's that's it's both it's fascinating and frustrating that they knew it was a bad look and did it anyway. That's
Especially like some of them, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, evil man. And he writes about Black people aren't really people. They don't really feel pain. They don't really feel emotion. They can't experience love. Like I believe he wrote that Phyllis Wheatley, who was a Black poet, like we can't really call her work poetry because Black people aren't capable of those kinds of complex emotions.
ew.
But then also writes that like slavery is a moral stain and it's a sin and like we will be judged for this and it probably won't last forever, and the Black people whom we enslaved are going to hate us for what we're doing to them. And like, but at no point does he ever stop owning slaves? He owns them until the day that he dies, and he has the ability to free them in his, like, will when he dies, and he doesn't. Well, some of them he does, but most of them he doesn't.
Wow. That totally ruins sexy prince like Thomas Jefferson as depicted in Hamilton. But that's more
Yeah,
Daveed Diggs is hot, Thomas Jefferson is not. And so
amen.
when and how did slavery end? Because the narrative we get from Republicans is that by the generosity of Abraham Lincoln, Republicans freed the slaves, so you can't hold them accountable for anything racist they've done since.
Yeah, as much as I would love for Republicans to be, the progressive party like they were considered at the time of Lincoln, um, that's just not reality. If we're playing word association at that point,
Yeah.
but so many people perceive that slavery ended after the Civil War, and we fought the Civil War to, we being the Union, fought the Civil War to end the scourge of slavery, and then it was just over. But that's not really how it happened, right? So we know that after 1776, right, we have the start of the United States of America as opposed to the 13 British colonies. At the time, slavery was legal and practiced in every one of the 13 colonies that would come to be the states. So Vermont, for example, Vermont was not a colony. Vermont became a state after the American Revolution. And Vermont, in their founding constitution, said slavery is legal. We're not doing that here. We're not playing these
Oh my
games.
gosh. Good for
Um,
you. You
yeah, let's go
deserve
Vermont.
maple syrup. As a Canadian, there's like some contentiousness, but like fine, I'll let you have it.
But yeah, every time I am near Vermont, I'm coming home with at least a few boxes of the
Yeah.
little maple leaf candies. My favorite. I tried to make them at home, but I burned myself once, and I'm done now. Um, so, uh, legal and practice in every state when the American Revolution is happening, or every colony. I'll use those words interchangeably, but we understand that, like, prior to 1776, colonies; after 1776, states, but most of the names are the same. So then we also have states like Massachusetts, for example, which does not legally abolish slavery in its constitution, but does use broad language like freedom, and that applies to everybody. So then through that language, people are able to uh, go to court and say that slavery should be abolished. And so then a few years after the creation of the Massachusetts Constitution, slavery is then abolished in Massachusetts. Some states do like total abolition, like Vermont, for example. Total asterisks. There's still some legality there as like as punishment for a crime, like it says in our Constitution now, um, or in the 13th Amendment, rather. Or they do something like what a Pennsylvania, a New York, a New Jersey, a Connecticut does, which is gradual emancipation or gradual abolition. So, let's say, for example, in New Jersey, they set a gradual emancipation where after a certain date, I believe it's 1804, checks notes again, Jersey, 1804. After
Nice.
1804, um, they said that people born to enslaved mothers, right, because slavery legally, depending on the state, followed the legal status of the mother. If your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved. Didn't really matter if your mother was very, very, very white in her lineage, right? There's like no way to quantify that really, but at the time they attempted to. And then your father was your white enslaver and you looked, I don't know, like Elsa from Frozen.
Yeah.
If your mom was enslaved, you were enslaved.
Wow.
So in 1804, an enslaved person born into slavery after 1804 would remain enslaved if they were a woman until they were 21, if they were a man until they were 25. And the language of the document, I don't believe uses the word enslaved until 21. It probably just uses the word of like bound to contract with owner until 21, but like that blurs the line between what it is to be enslaved and what it is to be an indentured servant. Indentured servants are held on contract, which will eventually expire, and their children will not be held as indentured servants. There's ways to get around that too. Anyways, um, but what that does not do is free people who are born into slavery prior to 1804. So then many states like New York and Pennsylvania had laws later that said, okay, enough time has passed. and we're going to abolish it completely. So anybody who's still alive who was born prior to 1804 is now free, even if they've been enslaved for pretty much their entire life. So those kinds of things happened in like Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. New Jersey is an interesting example though, because they did not have that law that said, okay, anybody still alive is free now. That didn't come until 1865 with the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery after the Civil War. So when we're thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation toward the end of the Civil War, that we commonly understand as an abolition of slavery totally, it actually didn't apply to states like New Jersey, which were very much still practicing slavery, like with limits. It only applied to the states that had seceded from the Union, so the Confederacy. It maintained slavery in the border states. It maintained slavery in the Union in the ways that it continued to exist. And so in that way, it can very pretty obviously be seen that the Emancipation Proclamation was a tool of war to crush the economy of the South, which was completely dependent on enslaved labor. Much of the North was also dependent on the importation of slaves, enslaved people, the insuring of enslaved people as property, um, using the industry of the North to develop products using the raw materials grown through enslaved labor in the South. A lot of the United States or the 13 colonies um, economy was built on enslaved labor, to the point that like when we think about the ways that the American economy was built, many people will say like, oh, it's the railroads, it's tech, it's the banks, it's oil, it's agriculture, whatever. I believe if you combined uh, railroads, agriculture, banking, insurance, and oil all into one, it still wouldn't be more than the economic base provided by enslavement. So, I actually forgot what your original question was.
Oh,
But those
oh,
are my thoughts.
thank you. Yes, how and when did slavery end? So it's obviously not a cut and dry question, but I think that's so interesting that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to New Jersey, or it was mostly just a way to spite the South. Because when I tell people I host a podcast called "War is Stupid," they're like, "But what about the Civil War? Do you love slavery?" And I'm like, no, the Civil War, Lincoln himself said that if I could have preserved the Union without freeing the slaves, I would have. So selfishly, that fits my whole agenda. It wasn't the people at the top who freed the slaves. It was the people, the slaves themselves, who demanded it. Right. So tell us about slave rebellions. That is an often buried history.
For sure. Yeah, so I think in the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, writes about these like misconceptions of Black history, like white people enslaved us and then white people freed us. So it's like, oh, we should be thankful to white people for ending slavery. It's like, well, they started it, at
Yeah.
least the system of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade that we had at the time. Um, so
Yeah, you don't get credit for ending a problem you created and perpetuated.
100%, and have benefited from for hundreds of years. So there were many ways that enslaved people rebelled against slavery, right? So there are small ways like breaking tools or working more slowly, or engaging in means to limit your like personal reproduction. So like a lot of enslaved women would engage in ways to try to not reproduce and have more children. That that could mean uh, trying to limit their ability to reproduce. That could mean ending the lives of the children that they might have, so that their children would not know the violence of slavery. Um, and then in some bigger ways, like um, running away or self-emancipating, or in armed revolution, right? So many of the revolutions of enslaved people don't make it into our textbooks. And that's for a lot of reasons. One reason being that the institution of enslavement requires white people, not just enslavers, white people generally, to believe and support the idea that Black people deserve to be enslaved, that they are inferior, that it is actually better for them to be ruled by these like benevolent, better white people, which is absolutely ridiculous. But the idea that Black people have the ability to revolt successfully would indicate that they have like, like some level of intelligence and they could outsmart or outdo white folks. They, at the same time, had other myths that slavery actually it wasn't that bad. Enslaved people were just like part of your family, and Black people should be lucky to be like clothed and housed and fed, right? Like not fed enough, not clothed well,
My
not
God.
housed well, sick and dying all the time, beaten, dismembered, and such.
And we still see
Um,
that rhetoric with, yeah, when immigrants and migrants are being housed in warehouses. It's like, you're welcome for the
right,
shelter and the food.
right. Like there's maggots in my food and I can't get healthcare, but yeah, sure. Well, we can't get healthcare outside of there anyway. But anyway, healthcare is an entirely different conversation, also related to racism, but that's not for today. So there's the idea that Black people are actually better under slavery and should be thankful, which is again absolutely ridiculous. I think was it Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio who said like, well, Indian people were taught skills like metalwork.
Oh
I'm
my
like,
God.
you know who has metalwork? Africans in Africa. We didn't need to be brought here for that. But the idea that someone would escape or run away or risk their life or take up arms against their enslaver directly contradicts the idea that they're actually enjoying this and this is good for them. So they didn't like to broadcast when armed rebellion or any type of rebellion happened because it would run completely counter to all the myths that they need people to buy into in order to justify enslavement beyond an economic justification. Um, so many times they were not spoken about when they did happen, and they happened incredibly often. Um, and we also know that because there are a lot of laws designed to tamp down the ability of rebellion. For example, there are laws that say that Black people, free or enslaved, cannot drink hard liquor. They can have beer, but they can't have hard liquor because then they might like revolt. There are rules that Black people cannot have access to drums because like drumming might get them riled up and get them to revolt.
My God.
That Black people cannot congregate in groups of more than 3 unless they're specifically doing something that their owner has permitted them to do, because if they, um, enter into organizations, they might plan a revolt. Free Black people and enslaved Black people in many states were not allowed to interact or even to be seen by one another, because if a enslaved Black person got used to seeing freedom in Black people, they might think that they should have that too. So there are like hundreds of laws all over the 13 colonies to try to limit even the possibility of thinking that freedom was an option for Black people. So yeah, there were many armed revolts, many small acts of resistance and rebellion. And so when we're thinking about like, talking about slavery makes like young white kids feel bad. There were white people who were also abolitionists. There were white people and Black people who were in community with each other, who were marrying and having families consensually there wasn't enslavement in that scenario. And so there are so many options or so many opportunities to show how Americans worked together against the evil of slavery that we just don't tell if we completely ignore it as like an inconvenient, uh, violent truth of the foundation of our nation.
Yeah, and just how inextricable is the history of the United States with the history of slavery? Like, what percentage of presidents, Supreme Court justices, the people we look to as moral arbiters, literally, yeah, enslaved people?
For sure. So we have this uh, tendency to kind of deify our founding fathers
Hmm.
and our leaders, and like we cannot critique them because they were genius and they were brilliant. Blah, 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 blah. Did many of them write really well and like create tax codes that worked well? Yeah, sure. Were many of them also like evil people who use brutal violence against enslaved people? Also, yes. So in looking at pull up my notes again so I make sure I get this right. So in looking at our earliest founding fathers, right? So the first 12 presidents, 10 of them
My
were
God.
enslavers.
I find
I don't
myself
many of us
saying, oh my God, a lot because Oh my God.
I know it's challenging to think about, like, the framers of the Constitution, right? So or not the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. There are 56 white men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Of those 56, I believe it's 41 were enslaving people. So they're writing this beautiful language about freedom and liberty and, like, I don't know what else is in there. Lots of stuff. Freedom and liberty and, like, property was in a lot of the original documents, which, makes a lot of people raise an eyebrow of, like, what are you considering to be property? But they don't say. They actually switch property out with pursuit of happiness. Um,
Also,
but
pursuit of happiness in itself is a euphemism or is a second draft to
yeah, it's in the second
to
draft. They
obfuscate slavery. Oh my God.
mhm.
That's
Unclear of if it is to obfuscate slavery specifically. Like the idea of property rights comes from like French Enlightenment thinking and like John Locke and all that, which was like Thomas Jefferson's jam. But like slavery was also Thomas Jefferson's jam. So when when we're thinking about the first 12 presidents, 10 of them were enslavers. The only two who weren't are father and son, right? So that's John Adams and John Quincy Adams are the only two presidents of the first 10 presidents who didn't own slaves, and they happen to be father and son. By 1865, right, so the end of the system of chattel slavery after the Civil War, or after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, 63% of all US presidents who existed when slavery was an option for them owned slaves, or were slavers. I struggle to the language that I was taught to use, like, growing up in America was slaves, but, like, those are people. They're
Mhm.
enslaved people being enslaved by people. So sometimes I'll, like, catch myself saying the word slave and, like, backtrack, which is what I just did there. The first 30 US Supreme Court justices, 26 of the first 30 owned people as
Wow.
much as they like, you can't own a person, but legally they did. And so when we're thinking about the people who wrote our earliest laws, wrote our constitutions, adjudicated in our court system, the vast majority of them were enslavers. So when we're thinking about like our founding documents, like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and we're thinking about these foundational documents as like almost biblical, almost religious. We're thinking about the people who wrote them as like godlike, uh, virtuous, righteous. There's also the contradiction there that these people also owned human beings or claimed to own human beings. And you cannot enslave a person without the utilization of violence. People are not meant to be enslaved. You are not meant to be imprisoned. There will be an attempt to leave or something that someone chooses to do using their own free will that the person who claims to own them does not like. And that results in violence. So that's 26 of the first 30 Supreme Court justices. And if we added up all of the Supreme Court justices we have ever had from the beginning of the United States Supreme Court right up until today, more than half of all of our Supreme Court justices ever were enslavers.
And
Still today.
oh my God, in the year of our Lord 2026.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of that is like to do with uh the lifelong appointments that Supreme
Mhm.
Court justices have. They tend to stay in office for a very long time. And the United States is not a very old nation at all. But for the vast majority of our history, we were one of the largest slave societies on the planet. Like, I think, I don't know the exact year. I have this somewhere else in my notes. But um, by the time that the United States is as far away from the legal discrimination of Black people than we spent in that time, you and I and everyone we have ever known will already be dead.
Wow. Yeah. I keep thinking that Thomas Jefferson, great writer, beautiful flowery language. That's the original separating the art from the artist. That's what they're trying to tell us.
Yeah,
Like, look at his words, not at his deeds.
100%. And then often, like, people will say, like, okay, well, he also wrote that slavery was bad. And it's like, okay, a lot of politicians today think child sexual assault and trafficking is bad, but they do it.
Yeah,
So I don't really care how much you talk about how awful this thing is. If you're doing it, you know it's bad and you're doing it anyways.
that's
And I think
arguably
that also
worse. That shows like an
I
element.
agree.
Oh, wow.
You're aware of that what you're doing is horrible and you continue to do it. But I think at the core of United States history, American history, then and now, capital, money, power is all at the core of what actually guides these people's decisions, not morality. And it was economically better for white men to enslave Black people than it was for them to, I don't know, as they claim to care about their immortal soul, not be doing that. But they cared about how much money, power, access they had in their mortal life, and they cared about anything else.
What story would you tell as we approach the 250th birthday of the country? As long as there were horrible things, there was resistance to said horrible things, and celebrating that shouldn't be suppressed. It's a better story. Like, as a screenwriter, as a person who loves a narrative, I think rather than suppressing the true history of slavery, tell the story of the people who fought for freedom. That's what you've been claiming this whole time anyway.
Yeah, so I think that there are so many ways to incorporate the presence and contributions of Black people, both the contributions that the institution of enslavement provided to the financial backbone of the United States, but also all of the contributions that are lesser known that Black people provided during the colonial era during the Reconstruction era, during the American Revolution. Like, for example, like inoculation prior to vaccinations were that knowledge was brought to the 13 colonies through an enslaved person named Onesimus in Boston. Um, some of the most formative American poets and designers and architects were Black people who were not paid for their labor. And then the things that they created went on to influence American culture today. Things like soul food, things like the concept of porches.
That's so cool.
th-
Why? What's the story? I love a good patio.
yeah, me too. I would love a wraparound porch.
Yeah.
But porches were not common in um, European houses. Porches were much more common in Africa, where they were used. Torches and awnings specifically were used to help cool homes and provide areas for people to like have shade but still be outside. And so they were introduced to architecture in the United States primarily by descendants of Africans or enslaved people who had descended from Africa. Um, and so now the porches are like a quintessentially American thing. Like when we think about like colonial architecture, so much of it is like porches and columns. And
Yeah.
columns are, you know, Roman, I'm sure. But porches were introduced by Black people, and so much of like American music was introduced by Black people. Even like rock and roll or elements of country. But when we pretend that everything that is important about what it is to be American is attributed to the whiteness of our founders or like European ideals or ideals of Christianity, it's just not true. And it like removes such flavor and texture and joy and pain of American history because it is complex and it is complicated, but that doesn't mean that we ignore the parts that don't always feel great. And there's also such a story to tell about how far we've come, but also that we should be farther by now. So, like, for example, in a lot of Thomas Jefferson's writing, he writes that yes, slavery is bad, but like it's the British that made us do that,
Oy.
and it's actually their fault. Like they poisoned us with the scourge of slavery. But then after independence from Britain, the United States keeps doing slavery. Thomas Jefferson himself keeps doing slavery, keeps enslaving people. Um, so we could tell the story of like a Vermont, for example, that as soon as they got statehood, they said, we're not doing that here. We could tell the story of like gradual emancipation, how many states in the North chose to end the institution of enslavement earlier than many people in the South. We could tell the story of the Quakers who originally did enslave people, but over time did a lot of work to end slavery. We could talk about Black Americans who risked life and limb and the lives of their entire families to seek slavery and then to go back into slavery to bring more people out. who risked their lives and their freedom. We could talk about how Black people were legally not allowed to join the military at the beginning of the Civil War, um, but demanded to be able to join the military and then put their own physical bodies back on the land that they had been previously enslaved on for the hope of earning freedom for themselves or for others. But it's inconvenient for many people to tell that story because they have to admit that that original evil is there and it is always going to be. But if we can't tell that story honestly, then we can't be the nation that we say that we are, that we say that we want to be because we're lying. And if American history was really that great, we wouldn't have to lie about it. There is a great story to tell there. There is a lot of complications and contradictions and pain, but to do anything else is just like a straight up lie. And you know, a lot of Christian nationalists claim to care about sin, and I'm pretty sure lying is one of them.
Wow, yes. Yeah, one of the top 7 even. I think that's so interesting. Like, I wonder where it got into people's heads that like history is supposed to make you feel good. You're supposed to read history and then, oh, it's supposed to be like a cuddly, inspiring um thing. If you want cuddly, inspiring, hopeful history, then there's nothing more inspiring than seeing how things have progressed. Like that is objectively a better story to tell.
Slavery was so evil, and we have done everything we can to try to rectify the evils of slavery. We haven't, but like we could use that messaging of like, we've come a long way, we have a lot further to go, and we're going to work so hard to get there. Like, I believe part of Freedom 250 or the 250 Coalition or whatever it's called. There are multiple organizations in that process are trying to like get people to love learning about American history and also getting people to love American history and also like frame what the next 250 years of American history looks like. And I'm combing through this website looking for any like meaningful grappling with the genocide of indigenous people, with the dispossession of land from indigenous people using like false treaties, with the enslavement of Black people, and it just doesn't come up. And we cannot understand the first 250 years of American independence without meaningfully grappling with those topics. We can't understand the material conditions that exist today without mentioning those topics. And we certainly can't plan for the next 250 years without mentioning those topics because we'd have to ignore the inequalities of today. So if we're seeking to ignore so much of what has built America into what America is, how could we possibly plan for the future? Because we don't understand the present, we don't understand the past. Part of what I was looking for in my notes earlier was just like some quick maths on how much time was spent in enslavement, right? So we know that the first Black people brought to the United States were brought here by English pirates in 1619, which is the year before the Pilgrims sailed on the Mayflower to Plymouth Rock. And so the Civil War or the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1865. It wasn't adopted by all the states until varying degrees later, but let's say that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. It didn't, but like let's use that to have that number. That's 246 years that slavery was being practiced on American soil, the land that would come to be the United States. It is then still legal to discriminate against Black people, against people for their race generally, but I'm speaking about Black people specifically today, until 1968 with the last of the Civil Rights Acts. Obviously, discrimination still happens, right? The Civil Rights Act didn't like suck the racism out of people's brains.
If
So
only.
that's right. You can't do that. People do a lot of things they can't do. So then between 1865 and 1968, that's 103 years. Within those 103 years, we have Jim Crow, white terrorism, the Great Migration, Black codes, etc. We have a very short window of what's called Reconstruction, where we had the original Civil Rights Acts that gave Black people the ability to like run for office and vote, and we had our first Black senators and our first Black congressmen, and then Jim Crow took hold after federal protections were removed from the South, and we didn't have another black senator until a long time after that. I want to say it was like the 70s, maybe later. So it's 103 years of Jim Crow. We'll call it that. So together, enslavement was 85 years longer than it's been since enslavement. And then there's been 58 years between the end of the civil rights movement and today. So, like, my parents are 55 years old. Anybody 3 years older than my mom and dad was born into a country where it was legal and enforceable to discriminate against Black people. So by the time we are further away from the legal discrimination of Black people than we are from it, more quick maths, 246, 103.
Yeah, I've said it on the podcast before that it's crazy that my dad is older than legal interracial marriage. Like, my dad is 65.
Mm-hmm.
That's just an insane stat.
What was that? 1968? Okay. Yeah. So by the time that we are further away from the legal discrimination of Black people than we are close to it, the year will be 2317.
Oh my God. Hopefully, if you're listening to this from the year 2317, thanks for listening. Hopefully things have gotten better. There's so much work to be done, but it's actually inspiring to hear about the work that has been done. It's been done before, which means it can be done again. Like, that's just a better protagonist than the people who did the enslaving.
I completely agree. Like, there's so much that we have overcome and that we will still overcome, but it's important to tell that story and like not pretend like it didn't happen. And then to your point about like your dad is older than interracial marriage, I remember when I was growing up, my parents were teaching me about marriage equality or same-sex marriage. And my mom told me that when my parents married, when my parents is white, when my parents is Black, when my parents married, it was still illegal in multiple state constitutions for a Black person to marry a white person. Obviously, like, it being made legal on the federal level nullifies the state constitutions, but in Alabama, for example, there were still plenty of people who attempted to get married in Alabama and who were told, like, we won't do that because our state constitution won't allow it. And of course, it's illegal for that person to not allow that marriage, but you have to sue them to get them to allow it. And like, many people don't have access to that. So when we're thinking about the time that's passed, like, my parents are just a few years younger than the Civil Rights Acts. So when we think about like generationally, the first generation to have everyone born in that generation born after the legal discrimination against Black people and other people of color are millennials.
Wow.
Like, not every Gen Xer was born after the Civil Rights Movement or the Civil Rights Acts, but many of them were born before that era. So the only untouched generation by the Civil Rights Acts are millennials, or born completely after it. And then, like, if I'm thinking about my grandparents, for example, like, my grandparents are 76. I think they're 76. The majority of their lives was spent under segregation. So much of how they learned to be a person through their childhood and their adolescence and their early adulthood was spent through segregation. Like, my family's been in the North for my generation, my dad's generation, my grandparents' generation. But the generation before that, my great-grandparents, moved up north during the Great Migration. And so I have aunts and uncles great aunts and uncles who were sharecroppers. And like, the history, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the history of sharecropping, but in the South during Jim Crow, many people were forced into sharecropping. So you had to have a job, or you could be arrested and imprisoned for vagrancy. And then if you were in prison, you were often used under convict leasing, where they would have you basically be enslaved, because it's legal to enslave someone as punishment for a crime, air quotes. Or you could be a sharecropper, and you can have a little bit of land, doesn't really belong to you, but you can live on often the land of the same people who were enslaving your family, years before. And you get paid but you also like pay rent to live there, and you often have to pay for childcare to live there. You have to pay for your food, and they don't pay you enough to make any money. They pay you enough to pay off your quote unquote debt or to have you go further into debt so that you can never leave. Um, so they found different ways to not legally imprison people often or enslave people, but to have them indebted to the land for their entire lives so that they couldn't leave. Um, and then also at the same time, harming people and killing people through organizations like the KKK or like other types of like white terrorist organization. There were many, many different names for those organizations. And then when Black people like did do well for themselves, they often had their towns burnt down by white vigilantes. And so when we're thinking about like the progress that has been made, there have always been moments of regression after big moments of American progress as it relates to racism and anti-Blackness. And we have to tell those stories. Otherwise, we don't really understand the current inequalities that exist. And that could lead people to think, well, if all of these people are existing under racism and racial capitalism, then but I don't have an understanding of how racism is operated, then the problem is them.
Mm.
And that thought is racist.
And I feel like American culture is so obsessed with just like black and white thinking, no pun intended, but like heroes and villains, the founding fathers are the heroes. But it's important to tell the stories of, the other heroes who have been here even longer, who predate the Mayflower.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's very little mention of that in like the documents of Freedom 250 that don't talk about the nations of people that already existed here. And that still do, but that gets left out of our history books as well.
And as we wind down, I don't want to engage in toxic positivity, but is there anything that gives you hope, just to end on a lighter note? Where can we
Mhm.
find hope?
Sure. So I find a lot of hope in the timeline. And I know that I just mentioned to you that the timeline is like predominantly in enslavement and in discrimination. But what we do notice is that there has always been a backlash of regressivism after moments of progress for Black people. Um, and so after emancipation, for example, we had like 10 to 12 years of Reconstruction and federal protections for the recently enslaved, and many formerly enslaved people were granted some rights for the first time, and some land for the first time, and some ability to inherit. And then all of that was taken away after the federal protections were removed, and Jim Crow and white terrorism took hold in the South and much of the North and the Midwest, but this was predominantly felt in the South and much of the Midwest. And then almost 100 years later, we have the Civil Rights Movement, right? So American history textbooks will often tell us like there was slavery and then there wasn't, and then there was Martin Luther King, but like there's so much time in between that, so much time of like horror and terror, which the Civil Rights Movement being a moment of racial progress, followed by then the war on drugs and the war on crime that disproportionately marginalized Black people, brown people, poor people, immigrants, etc., followed by moments of progress like Black Lives Matter, like the Stop Asian Hate movement, like in some ways the election of the first Black president. Huge moments, whether they're symbolic or whether they are materially felt, followed by whatever is happening right now. But every time that balance between progress and regression has happened, the time in between them has gotten shorter and the time of progress has gotten longer. So I don't know how that will look in the next few years of our lives, but I do know that there are more people now who believe in progress than there have been in previous iterations of the American story. There are more ways for us to speak to each other, to tell our stories, to share information, and to build solidarity than there have been before. And previous generations of Americans have made so much beautiful progress through so much awful and evil that I feel a personal responsibility that I have to do everything I can to get us closer to that next piece of progress, because so many people have done so much more than I have, which with so much less than I have. And so that's what makes me hopeful of that. Like the fight is always worth it. whether or not I even see it. Doing whatever I can to get to that next place of progress is always going to be worth it. The timeline tells me so. The stories of my ancestors and my family and my community tells me so. And I'd rather give it all I got with the time that I have than despair.
Thank you so much. I love that. That was a perfect uplifting note to end on. So where can people find you in on the internet or in real life?
Sure. Nobody should find me in real life.
Yeah.
My real life is
Yeah.
no, if for my academic things, you can go on Google Scholar and look up Victoria Alexander-Thompson. Um, Most of my work is through the University of Southern California or the University of Maryland. You can also read my writing on Substack, which is Victoria_PhD, which is also where I'm findable on all social media, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Twitter. I'm not really on there, and I'm not calling it X.
Yeah.
YouTube, it's YouTube Shorts, but it's on there at Victoria_PhD.
Amazing. And I'll have all the links below so it'll be easier. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was awesome. And I'm excited to see you, at the next Zoran party.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Orly, and thank you so much for having this platform and this space to have really important conversations in really accessible ways.
Thank you. That means a lot to me coming from, like a deeply researched academic. You're doing incredible stuff. So thank you. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.